It's crazy.
We're doing awesome this afternoon, Colonel. I hope you are too. And you're right. A lot of stuff is popping off in the world right now, and I'm sitting here looking at it and saying, well, what did we expect? Thank you, Colonel.
You're welcome. We know about that, and we know about that one, and we know about that one. It is definitely worth the last 3 years, almost 3 years of doing this, to be able to live through what we're living through right now, with the knowledge that we've gained in this endeavor. And there's been a lot of hard work among all of us. And it definitely helps to understand the dynamics, to be able to walk through this particular period. So, anyway, awesome. So, having said all that, let's get finished with our book. We are on the last chapter. The last chapter talks about the war on drugs, corporatization, and privatization. It starts off with talking about the counterinsurgency campaign against the FARC, and that obviously it did not eliminate the drug trade out of Colombia, and that the Colombian cocaine continues in a much larger scale than when we started, despite having poured billions of our taxpayer dollars into the effort, both in the US and in Europe. It exploded, almost as if that was the design and not ever to stop the drug trades. And as I just posted, Illini, God bless him. Oh, I see him. Put in the comments an article that was written about the accusation that the CIA was involved. And I mean, at this point, it's just laughable, based on all the research that we've done, that the McCoy had made the allegation that the CIA was involved in the opium trafficking out of Southeast Asia. And the uproar that that created and the censoring attempt of that information by the CIA, like, we wouldn't ever do that. And yet, as I pointed out in response to his article that he posted, not only did they do that there, but they did it twice in Afghanistan. And it just so happens that Operation Condor kicks off and the drug trade moves to where? Latin America, where Operation Condor was. So we are either to believe that everywhere the CIA goes, that drug trafficking just happens to follow them, or that they're in on it to begin with. And my brain does not allow for that many coincidences in a row. Sorry, given what we know. So it's funny looking back on that, the attempt to convince the American people, and obviously hindsight's 2020, but it gets laughable at some points when you read some of their protesting along the way. Okay. The networks of politicians, police, private security firms, private military firms, and ordinary citizens investing in illegal enterprises for a high return can be described as state organized crime, which is exactly what narco trafficking is. Or otherwise, if the state wasn't in on it, they would stop it. Western governments smuggle arms and drugs, participate in assassinations, conspiracies, and terrorist acts to further their foreign policy objectives, acts defined by law as criminal and committed by state officials in pursuit of their jobs as representatives of the state. That's an actual legal definition. Criminologists point to piracy as an early form of state organized crime, which, of course, if you listen to Warhamster and I, he tells you the only difference between the legal and illegal trafficking of anything is a letter from the government. So Today, it is likely to be carried out under the auspices of state agencies with investigative powers, such as the CIA, FBI, or IRS, or all of the above, to include the DEA, but the author left them out. U.S. imperialism, political, economic interest in the drug trade reflects Marx's dictum that the internal logic of a capitalist system involves the continual expansion of production and profit, which in Colombia was achieved through narco colonialism. Profits from the drug trade far exceeded what is needed to fund U.S. covert operations, wars, presidential campaigns, and other activities. Most of the profits from the drug trade are hidden, usually in offshore financial institutions where corporations acquire these funds. The use of American private corporations, whether wholly owned by the CIA as proprietaries or outsourced as private contractors, has become a common practice in regions of drug trafficking. The operations of these private defense contractors in the counterinsurgency strategy in Colombia are crucial for corporations. Theodore Shackley, a former CIA operative, wrote in support of state organized crime in Asia and Latin America during the Cold War, quote, "These, then, are all facets of what irregular warfare technocrats call, for better or worse, the third option." That was chilling to me when I read that, because that harkens back to our research on the third way. Going on with the quote, "To the persuasions of diplomacy and trade on the one hand and military force on the other. It also includes all aspects of covert action, which in some lexicons is defined as the influencing of people and the shaping of events through the use of political, economic, and military factors, without the sponsor of this activity being identified in an attributable manner." Unquote. That, in a nutshell, explains the narco trafficking. Paradoxically, the cocaine trade involves the billions of dollars in U.S. military hardware, which we pay for, used on the war on drugs and terror. This phenomenon is described as a military industrial narcotic complex. The Cold War saw the growth of this complex that involved companies outsourced by the CIA, such as Air America, SAT, Setco, DIACSA, Vortex, and a Costa Rica seafood company, all of which assisted in covert drug trafficking operations. Counterinsurgency operations by the United States would not have been possible without the involvement of private defense contractors. In October 2000, an important conference was held to discuss the U.S. plans for Colombia in the 21st century that involved the U.S. Department of Defense, State Department, intelligence community, and the Colombian military. Colombia was presented as the linchpin of stability in the region. The conference report stated that, quote, "Prosecuting the war does not contradict the peace process, and regaining control over the drug-producing areas of Colombia means wresting territorial control from the insurgents, such as the FARC," unquote. In other words, a smoking gun admission that the entire attack on the FARC was so they could control the drug trade. The report pointed out that the self-defense groups, popularly called paramilitary, need to be included in the peace process because the population they represent was significant in size. To regain control of the FARC drug producing areas, the U.S. private defense provides military assistance to the narco elite so that drug profits continue to flow to the U.S. financial institutions, private banks, and transnational corporations. The report from the UNDPC in 1998 revealed that with increasing globalization, $2 trillion a day was being laundered through the world's financial system, a money launderer's dream. Several $100 billion are washed through the US financial system every year, virtually unchecked. The annual profits from global drug trade was estimated to be worth $300 to $500 billion, with a $250 billion amount going directly to US banks. So now you know why they don't ever do SARS reports or anything else, because they're enriching themselves. And again, all of this is going on supposedly underneath the nose of the Federal Reserve. Martin Woods, a former senior anti-money laundering officer at Wachovia Bank, which is now Wells Fargo, one of the largest in the United States, which investigators have recently found was money laundering for the Mexican drug cartels, says that the New York and London have become the world's two largest laundries of criminal and drug money and offshore tax havens. Not the Cayman Islands, not the Isle of Man, not Jersey, New York City, and the City of London. This pattern of drug money laundering banks is traceable back to the Reagan and Bush era. We've traced it back further, but we'll go with that. And they're talking about the big banks because remember, prior to the 1980s, when they started transitioning them to the actual real banks, they had set up BCCI and Nugent Hand in the early 70s, along with the Vatican Bank, to do this. Catherine Austin Fitts, who had been managing director of the Wall Street firm Dillon Reading Company before becoming Assistant Secretary of Housing under George H.W. Bush, stated that somewhere between 250 and 300 billion from the importation of drugs, illicit drugs, from Colombia went to Florida, New York, Texas, and California. According to Fitts, just a decade ago, these money laundering states provided 80% of the presidential campaign funds. Fitts is now president of Solari Incorporated and managing member of Solari Investment Advisory Services. She claims that corporations have stock values based upon annual net profits known as price earnings, or the POP, and identify the multiples of income at which a stock trades, that is, the stock value. The multiplier effect of stock values can reach a factor of 30. Fitts estimated the figure for drug money entering America reaches up to 6 times 250 billion annually through money laundering activities, resulting in an estimated 1.5 trillion per year in US cash transactions from the drug trade alone. Money deposited in the US is not difficult to monitor. The US Federal Reserve register any deposits over $10,000 as a standard practice. According to Solomon Kalamanowicz, an economic expert and member of the Colombian Central Bank Board of Directors, the estimated wealth of Colombian narco elite in the early years of the post-cartel economy was $76 billion, which is about 30% of the country's total wealth, less than half of US annual profits from the drug trade. Robert Auerbach of the University of Texas was told by the US GAO inspectors in 2002 that the vaults of the Los Angeles Federal Reserve have the second most currency in the entire Federal Reserve because all of the drug flowing in to California. Auerbach observed that officials who ran the Federal Reserve bureaucracy failed to monitor money laundering. Auerbach estimates that $80 billion in cash from corrupt accounting practices in the Federal Reserve have been stored at its second largest vault facility in Los Angeles, second only to New York in the volume of cash transactions. Nevertheless, there is no conclusive evidence or precise figures that demonstrate drug money being laundered through any of the financial system. Not documented, because they don't ever look. The Colombian narco economy allows narco capital to flow into the US and return. Colombian financial institutions are engaged in currency transactions involving international narcotic trafficking proceeds that include significant amounts of US currency. The Colombian money laundering has not been prosecuted, and neither businesses nor assets have been seized, nor have farms on which cocaine is grown or property, they haven't been seized either. This untouchability prevails throughout the Colombian banking and financial system through contraband, real estate, and the narco elites' own front companies. And of course, it would take 2 seconds to figure out what they are with today's technology. The Colombian narco elites' financial needs are accommodated through the New York Stock Exchange. In June of 1999, news services reported that Richard Grasso, chairman of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, and members of his executive staff flew to Colombia. Others who attended the meeting were unnamed, but Grasso's visit was organized by the Colombian government, in particular, the Colombian ambassador to the United States, Luis Alberto Morano, said to be the closest friend of Grasso. I invite members of the FARC to visit the New York Stock Exchange so they can get to know the market personally, Grasso was quoted as saying. I truly hope that they do this. Media reported that Grasso had asked to meet Raul Reyes, the FARC's highest commissioner, to discuss foreign investments. I'm sorry, you just can't make this shit up. The purpose of the meeting was to bring a message of cooperation from U.S. financial institutions. Hey, dude, you got a lot of money. We'll launder it for you. In retrospect, Grasso's trip served as a fact-finding mission concerning the FARC's alleged role in drug trafficking. However, no deal was brokered with the insurgency as the U.S. government does not accept FARC's money. We'll take the Colombian government's money, just not the FARC. It was probably used as a spying expedition, if the truth be told. The FARC's long-held policy of legalization of drug consumption, and that's a misnomer, the legalization of the coca leaf, which is exactly what Bolivia did, was a means to eliminate drug trade that was also acceptable to Grasso. Christian Debris of a French newspaper contends that financial crime in a system closely linked to the expansion of modern capitalism based on an association of 3 partners: government, transnational corporations, and the mafia. This form of crime is part of a service industry in which the Americans have a considerable lead over its competitors, not only in know-how, but also in the vast financial and logistical resources that they were able to make available to multinationals. These include secret services of the world's most powerful state apparatus, i.e. the CIA, which with the Cold War over have moved into economic warfare. Yeah, that's funny coming from the French. Debris named U.S. corporations like Lockheed Martin, Boeing, IBM, General Motors, Exxon, General Electric, and Texaco. Here's a quote from him describing those corporations and their relationships. Big business complexity and political laissez-faire is the only way that large-scale organized crime can launder and recycle the fabulous proceeds of the activities. Politicians are directly involved, and their ability to intervene depends on the backing and the funding that keeps them in power. This collusion of interest is an essential part of the world economy. All this would be impossible without the power of the state and international and regional organizations, especially their ability to keep restrictive regulations to a minimum, to abolish and override such rules that do exist, to paralyze inquiries and investigations, to put them off indefinitely, and to reduce the grant anonymity from penalties. And of course, we know that. We've already discovered that every single commission investigation that Congress has ever done is a sham. It's a kabuki dance, as we call them. At the end of the Cold War, the use of U.S. private defense contractors began to replace much of the covert work done by the CIA. The transition was underway when private defense corporations were formed and contractors were deployed to Colombia and throughout the cocaine decade, well into the implementation of Plan Colombia. During the Clinton-Bush years, and for most of the Pastrana-Uribe presidencies, the majority of the profits went to American firms under the sponsorship of Plan Colombia. Lobbyists from big oil, arms manufacturing, and defense companies in the U.S. made $6 million in campaign contributions to Congress in support of Plan Colombia. Of the $1.5 billion initially approved for the program, just 13% went to the Colombian government to do any fighting against the enemy FARC. The rest flowed to corporate America. This is exactly what happened with Ukraine over and over again. The financially linked international capital organizes cocaine production locally, creating a powerful transnational class of businessmen and investors with common interest in private military companies and their mega projects, which again is what we discovered when we read the book about the paramilitary security and intelligence companies. PMC, private military company owners and employees, are current or former U.S. military or intelligence personnel, often with combat experience directly engaged in these counterinsurgency strategies. The use of PMCs and their activities in Colombia, as well as in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya, most recently have been cloaked in secrecy. Since the election of Barack Obama in 2008, the secrecy has intensified with discussions, research, and media commentary relating to the war on drugs, now centered on Mexico, not on Colombia. In 2010, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton stated that Mexico and Central America was facing an insurgency that required the equivalent of an overall Plan Colombia. This switch in public focus has been one of the major outcomes of the regionalization strategy. However, it has not reduced the involvement in the Colombian conflict. And again, you guys have heard me say, I think that's exactly what's going on right now. Focusing on Venezuela as opposed to the source, which we know to be Colombia. As in the Mexico drug war, Colombia has increasingly become a privatized war that goes well beyond the context of Plan Colombia. Just as George W. Bush had started in 2001, Obama had continued the fight against quote-unquote narco-terrorism by providing $600 million in military aid to protect the failed state under terrorist siege. Like Obama renaming the Overseas Contingency Operation, there is little reference to Plan Colombia unless the government spokespeople are referring to Mexico. That's called a diversion. The privatization of the war on drugs is primarily due to the changing character of the war on terror, which stretched American military capabilities in Iraq and Afghanistan, or so we're told. The expansionist role of American military force has posed a new security dilemma for U.S. imperialism that can only be achieved through the use of narco-colonialism applied through Cold War strategies from the Golden Triangle to the Crystal Triangle in the 80s and 90s. According to a survey conducted by international humanitarian organizations, the use of private military contractors is spreading rapidly across Latin America, despite the lack of studies on the changing security situation. It is not clear whether the increase in the number of private military companies in South America has been a direct result of Plan Colombia. In a recent press conference held in Bogota, General Douglas Fraser, who at the time was the commander of Southcom, reiterated the U.S.'s support for the ongoing war on drugs and terrorism. Fraser said, quote, "I reiterate the commitment of the U.S. government and Southern Command in support of Colombia's commitment to defend its democracy." They don't have a democracy, by the way. "Protect its citizens," which they're killing, "and improve the security, stability, and rule of law throughout the country." That's total garbage. Although there was no mention of private military or military personnel, as in the cocaine decade, Fraser's comments were not empty words to Colombian officials. They got what they wanted. Yeah, we're going to keep doing what we're doing, and you guys are going to keep enriching yourselves off of cocaine. The Colombian state is facing a deteriorating security situation in its war while struggling to discipline internal division amongst the narco elite. President Juan Manuel Santos has replaced the entire military command except for the National Police Director. These developments follow ongoing criticisms of attacks against the Colombian army, which Santos argues are signs of their weakness. According to Leon Valencia, director of an NGO which specialized in Colombian conflict, the FARC had been extensively reorganizing and adjusting their strategy over the past several years. They have a new structure and a new strategy that has given them good results, Valencia said. According to a report on the Americas, an influential nonprofit magazine which specializes in Latin America, they said it was difficult to calculate U.S. presence in Colombia. The counterinsurgency efforts has employed approximately 600 U.S. military personnel in Colombia, plus thousands of paramilitary troops, with hundreds more hired as private military contractors. They were working in search and rescue, mechanical areas, logistic areas, radar sites, and instructors. Information relating to covert activities within Colombia's narco military network is minimal, outdated, and difficult to maintain. What they do with all those billions of dollars that we send them if their military is outdated? That sounds weird. The role of private military contractors is obscured by another layer of secrecy. The U.S. government is not required to release information about their covert activities because of national security. Private military, in turn, can plead corporate confidentiality. The reason for this obscurity is to protect the U.S. from prosecution of war crimes. This is a quote from an agreement that was signed in 2003. For the aims in the present agreement, the expression person of the United States of America means any government employee including contractor or member of the Army, present or past, member of the government that enjoyed immunity against the penal jurisdiction by virtue of the international law, any way to subject the jurisdiction of the state that it sends, meaning the United States. So basically, everybody had immunity that was down there under the jurisdiction of the United States or a contract issued by the United States. The use of private military contractors enabled special operation forces under coordination of Southcom to work alongside private contractors for covert operations. Most importantly, private military contractors decentralize covert operations by decreasing the U.S. official level of involvement. That's called plausible deniability. These teams are the same ones that assist the Colombian narco military network in their war against their own citizens. The number of foreign private military contractors in Colombia and details regarding their services are top secret, with public records and registrations outlining their presence sealed. This situation creates ambiguity with respect to the transnational corporations that operate inside of Colombia and the number of people there. That a significant proportion of the transnational private military companies in Colombia have their headquarters in the US or the UK. The top 35, however, are among the most profitable corporations in the United States. A Los Angeles Times report that the US Congress is notified only of contracts worth more than $50 million each. When a license is granted, there is no reporting requirements or oversight of the work that typically lasts years and takes firms' employees to remote, lawless areas. Huge private military contractors that operate in Colombia are L3 Military Professional Resources Incorporated, best known by their acronym MPRI, located in Alexandria, Virginia. It is owned by L3 Communications. Kellogg Brown and Root, the Texas company that funded both LBJ's political career and Dick Cheney's career. Halliburton, it's a subsidiary of Halliburton. DynCorp Aerospace Technology in Reston, Virginia, and SAIC. All the ones that we're very familiar with because of the other book that we did. In 1998, the American air freight company Southern Air Transport, which was active in the cocaine decade, declared bankruptcy. However, investigators found that $32 million of the company's assets had been moved before they filed. The very same day, the CIA IG issued a report outlining allegations of SAT, Southern Air Transport, drug running. So, we know the report's coming out that implicates our proprietary company in drug running. So, we're just going to go ahead and file bankruptcy. No big deal. Proceeds from the sale of the Southern Air Transport assets were deposited in the personal bank account of the owner, James Bastian. He's a CIA lawyer in Miami. In 1999, other air cargo airlines were competing with SAT successor Southern Air to gain access to their Colombian flight schedule. Because we're going to keep control of it. We're just going to change the names. Those airlines were Polar Air Cargo, Kitty Hawk Aircraft Incorporated, and Taiwan's EVA Air, which happens, and also Evergreen Airlines. So Taiwan's EVA was a former CIA proprietary that took over Evergreen Air. The Journal of Commerce commented, this is a quote, "Air cargo executives from around the world have been invoking Latin America like a mantra for the past 2 years as one of the most promising areas in their industry because of the drug trade. The optimism was muted at times due to the volatility of the situation, but overall, it has steadily gained momentum. Today, with traditional buoyant routes across the Pacific showing deteriorating yields, because we've moved the drugs, the region is even more regarded as the El Dorado for air freight." They're all in on it. Information about cargo carried by these airlines is difficult to retrieve. but their operations were immensely profitable as components of the U.S. outsourced special operation teams in the war on drugs and terror. Two military contractors, DynCorp and MPRI, are of particular significance. According to the State Department, since 2007, DynCorp, among other companies such as Lockheed Martin and ARINC, have been major beneficiaries of Plan Colombia. DynCorp, which is a technology and services company with over 1.8 billion in annual revenue and more than 23,000 employees all over the world, was the largest private military company operating in Colombia. DynCorp, by the way, is the one that got accused of child trafficking and sexual misconduct in Bosnia, just so that you know, as well as other places. Its contracts with the US government account for 98% of the market share. DynCorp has been under US State Department contract in Colombia since 1991. And in 1998, it was awarded a $170 million 5-year contract. DynCorp planes and military helicopters are used for relocation missions that involve chemicals and biological warfare in Colombia. In 2000, DynCorp helicopters were also involved in 60 reported gun battles, all being done by a contractor. Richard Boucher, a State Department spokesman, had claimed that guerrilla fired at the private contractors involved in relocation missions. His comments to the press were made after admitting that the private U.S. citizens had been involved in a battle. DynCorp personnel have provided logistical support and training for the Colombian Army's anti-narcotic battalions, carrying troops into battle and rescuing shot down pilots. And how's that drug war going? Did we make any progress? No. DynCorp contract employees include military personnel with experience in Vietnam, the Middle East, and throughout Latin America. Corporate Watch reported that DynCorp mission deployments may be made to any worldwide location, including potentially outside of Central and South America. DynCorp has participated in eradication missions, training, and drug interdiction, and air transport, reconnaissance, search and rescue, airborne medical, ferrying equipment, and personnel from one country to another. DynCorp is the same private organization that the Reagan and Bush administration used to run arms and drugs during the cocaine decade. In 1998, a U.S. reporter who attempted to talk to DynCorp pilots at San Jose del Garibari said he was threatened with exclusion from the U.S. Embassy if he ever attempted to approach a DynCorp employee again. Another reporter said he was banned from the embassy-sponsored briefings after the reporter quoted a guerrilla leader as saying the U.S. advisors would now be under attack. Eagle Aviation Services and Technology, their acronym is EAST, a subcontractor of DynCorp, has flown U.S. State Department planes such as armed Iroquois, Bell Hueys, and T-65 Thrush crop dusters in top secret missions throughout Colombia for at least 15 years. Current and former State Department officials have argued that East's interest in Colombia has nothing to do with the controversial past. Jonathan Weiner, a name that sticks out, Senator John Kerry's aide during Iran-Contra in 2001, said, quote, "That was 15 years ago. The issue is what they're doing, not what they did," unquote. They're still doing the same thing. Employees of DynCorp has been involved in drug trafficking as well as consuming heroin, cocaine, and amphetamines. In May 12, 2000, in the year 2000, Colombian authorities intercepted a parcel containing a sample of liquid heroin in 2 bottles, which had been sent from DynCorp's Colombian office to its Florida airbase. This again was only a random inspection check, and the matter was covered up quickly. According to Nation reporter Jason Vest, who broke the story, Vest said DynCorp, the Colombian National Police, the DEA, and the State Department could not stick to a single account of what had occurred. In 1994, a DynCorp pilot stationed on a military base in southern Colombia died from a cocaine overdose. In 1999, the Colombian state prosecutors launched an investigation into amphetamine smuggling. Documents relating to all 3 cases were mysteriously disappeared, and the issue of drug trafficking abandoned by both Colombian and American authorities. Now, I'm not making any accusations, but you guys know that Sean Ryan has spoken openly about working as a contractor, most likely for DynCorp, and the fact that he OD'd taking drugs while he was in Colombia. Just going to leave that there. Richard Gadd, a retired United States Air Force officer, founded DynCorp during the cocaine decade. General Richard Secord, who directed SETSCO and SAT during that time, recruited agents for DynCorp's delivery operations. Richard Secord, the same guy involved in Iran-Contra? Yeah, that guy. A former CIA agent, Herbert Winokur, Winokur, was chairman of the board of DynCorp from 1988 to 1997. According to Daniel Gutman's classic 1978 book, The Shadow Government, he had been a permanent fixture in Washington's good old boy network of the Cold War years. Winokur was a member of the U.S. Council on Foreign Relations, a clearinghouse for the really choice frauds, according to Lieutenant Commander Al Martin, a former CIA operative who testified at John Kerry's Congressional Committee about Iran-Contra. When Winokur was director of Harvard Management Company and a member of the Harvard Corporation, funding dramatically increased from $5 billion to $19 billion in 6 years. Winokur also sat on the board of directors of Enron. The bankruptcy company full of fraud. Yeah. Catherine Austin Fitts believes that Winokur was responsible for destroying the economic research she undertook in 1996, which began to illuminate how the drug trade generates profits for Wall Street through subsidized housing, urban development, where Harvard Corporation is a major investor. Cases such as these suggest that there's much more to the failure of companies when bankruptcy is declared than just bad management. You think? The director of DynCorp since 1988, Dudley Meekum, is also the managing director of Winokur's Capricorn Holdings, Inc., and of Citigroup, which was implicated in money laundering activities in 1998, along with its consumer banking arm, Citibank. For Raul Salinas, the brother of the former Mexican president, Carlos Salinas, at the time the DynCorp contract in 1998 with the U.S. State Department, Treasury, and Commerce Departments, the company received a contract with the CIA and NASA. What the hell? To provide intelligence for the U.S. Whether this contract was linked to Plan Colombia is not known, but it became common knowledge that DynCorp acted as a front company on behalf of the CIA, hiring mercenaries for covert operations in Colombia. L3P MPRI is a military consultancy and supplies pilots and special forces elite training and security services worldwide. Many of its contract employees serve on the U.S. Council of Foreign Relations. An inside joke is that MPRI has more generals than the Pentagon. While DynCorp East is responsible for the skies, MPRI, with over 1,000 elite military and law enforcement officers, has responsibility for the ground. Primarily, this means engaging with the guerrillas in direct combat and protecting cocaine distribution routes that have been undermined by the FARC's presence. MPRI has worked with the Colombian Armed Forces and National Police in areas of planning, operation, including PSYOPs, training, logistics, intelligence, and personnel. General Edward Soyster, Soyster, an MPRI spokesperson, compared his company with other U.S. operating overseas. His analogy was they were like Coca-Cola. They're everywhere. In 2000, MPRI signed a $4.3 million one-year contract with the Defense Department to carry out force modernization of the Colombian Armed Forces and produce a report that, according to several analysts, provided few new ideas. This contract was not renewed. This may have been for two reasons. First, the MPRI's poor results in engaging with the resistance may have prompted the U.S. government to replace them. The second, U.S. need for oil and energy resources to sustain overseas deployments in growing numbers of world's hotspots probably took priority. Military companies provide active assistance involving combat, which has a strategic impact on the political and security environment of the countries involved. One expert on South America at the U.S. Institute for Policy Studies says, quote, Congress has little oversight of what private military companies are doing in Colombia, unquote. He went on to say that this is how the Pentagon wants it, because they can put more troops in Colombia than is legally allowed. He also said that the United States encourages the Colombian military, one of the least transparent and most abusive in the world, to be even more opaque. Not merely passive trainees. They fight alongside their clients' military forces and routinely rotate with U.S. advisors in Colombia. We have a database of more than 10,000 former soldiers who want military-related jobs. That number is now up to 20,000, by the way. General Soyster would say that they were some of the best trained military. A former congressional staffer described MPRI's activities as not sexy, but far bigger than Oliver North's operation. Alongside DynCorp and MPRI, Florida-based AirScan has been contracted by the Pentagon to monitor movement of the narcotics, which they can't ever find. AirScan of Rockledge, Florida, was formed in 1984 by U.S. Air Force commandos Walter Holloway and John Manzur. AirScan specializes in airborne surveillance, security operations, surveillance systems, terrain surveys, and training, and is one of very few companies in the world that can operate unmanned aerial vehicles at the time. AirScan is perhaps the most secretive private military company about its operations and the value of its contracts. But again, they can't find the drugs. The most advanced companies can't find the drugs. AirScan uses multi-spectrum cameras to pinpoint coca plantations. They seem to focus only on the FARC ones, though. Weird. In areas targeted for aerial fumigation, paramilitary working with the Colombian army arrive in helicopter gunships to clear the ground so that the planes, often piloted by Americans, are not shot down, but only in the FARC area. Day-to-day operations are overseen by a group of officials in the U.S. State Department called the Narcotics Affairs Section. The State Department even has an air wing in there. In 1998, AirScan was responsible for bombing the northern town of Santo Domingo, where at least 18 people were killed and at least 30 injured. The Colombian military, in a statement, said it was the FARC. They were all civilians. Time magazine described this as a standard eradication mission. You know, we're just crop dusting. They dropped a bomb. AirScan website lists the U.S. Forest Service as their client. The U.S. Forest Service. Since 1987, private contractors to the U.S. Forest Service has turned up all over the world in covert operations, some of them including drug trafficking. Did you know the U.S. Forest Service did that? I didn't. According to a lawsuit filed by a whistleblower, Gary Eitel, E-I-T-E-L, a pilot, aviation consultant, and aircraft broker, President Reagan moved as many as 50 C-130s into private contracts for use in a variety of covert operations that included drug smuggling and the direct enrichment of a number of private contractors and investors. That's what the whistleblower said. Reagan, the greatest president ever. A December 8, 1989 memorandum to George Leonard, a U.S. Forest Service Associate Chief, from Kenneth Cohen, the Assistant General Counsel, stated, quote, apparently, Department of Defense thinks that by having the Forest Service as an intermediary, if any future aircraft are used in drug smuggling, the Forest Service and not the DoD will suffer adverse publicity. Unquote. These operations, although given presidential approval, would appear to violate U.S. federal law. According to Lawrence Houston, a CIA former general counsel, the primary company responsible for all CIA covert air operations was a holding company, Pacific Corporation, also known as Pacific Power and Light. Did you know that? Also, Pacific Corp and Pacific Harbor Capital. Pacific Corp owned CIA companies such as Air America, SAT, and Intermountain Air. By the end of the cocaine decade, the CIA had made all of its aircraft available for use by private contractors for the U.S. government. We just didn't need them anymore, and it's fairly hard to keep them going, Houston said. So we're just going to sell them to our proprietary airlines under Pacific Corp, known as Pacific Power and Light. Northrop Grumman is another private military company that had been under contract to the U.S. government. Described as an aerospace and defense services company, it has 75,000 employees and projected revenues of $34 billion in 2010. In a similar vein with AirScan, it provides an unknown amount of contract employees to Colombia. In 1998, the Air Force Combat Command, ACC, awarded Northrop Grumman technical services contract to operate and maintain counter-narcotics surveillance and command system. You know, the one that can't find any of the drugs, except for the ones that's outside the CIA's control. The 5-year contract was extended and included performance maintenance, systems operations, and logistical support of 7 radar sites that can't find any of the drugs, and 10 associated ground satellite stations in Colombia, Peru, Venezuela, and Panama that didn't find any of the drugs. 5 of Northrop Grumman's radar stations are located in eastern southern Colombia to monitor the cocaine distribution routes and traffic patterns that can't find the drugs. This has allowed American and Colombian airplanes, both private and military, as identified by U.S. intelligence, to fly safely in and out of Colombia with the drugs and the chemicals and the weapons. I'm sorry, it's just crazy. The radar can employ a multiple beam to illuminate aircraft many times during a single antenna scan. The system has a range of 275 nautical miles and can cover targets up to 100,000 feet. Airplanes not identified by U.S. intelligence are shot down, because they're not ours. Not our drugs, ain't going nowhere. On February 2003, Northrop made world headlines when a U.S. spy plane carrying 4 CIA agents and 1 Colombian intelligence officer was shot down by the FARC. The CIA agents became prisoners of war. The remaining 2 were shot for resisting arrest. The crew members were contract employees of California Microwave Systems, a subsidiary of Northrop Grumman. The plane was essentially a U.S. intelligence plane in Colombia, according to Southcom. The data it collected was popular among covert agencies that needed up-to-the-minute data of cocoa production, drug laboratories, and the movement of the product. Again, movement of the product that the FARC was moving, not that the Colombian government and the narco elites were moving. They didn't find any of them. Okay, according to official sources, between 1998 and 2003, the FARC shot down 21 U.S. government aircraft connected to Lockheed, DynCorp, Northrop Grumman, California Microwave System, Matcom, M-A-T-C-O-M, and ARINC. According to the U.S. State Department officials, 4 were under contracts with the Aerial Division of the State Department. Lesser-known firms such as Rendon Group provided public relations support for the Colombian Army. SAIC assisted in imagery analysis, which is a CIA front as well. In October 2009, Obama and Uribe signed a military agreement that gave Washington access to 7 new military bases in Colombia. White House and Colombian officials maintained the agreement was aimed at fighting drug trafficking, the drugs that they can't find. U.S. Air Force documents state that the agreement offered a unique opportunity for conducting full spectrum operations. Well, what the hell have we been doing before then? With all of our satellites and intelligence and billions, if not trillions of dollars at this point that we put to use not finding the drugs. The Pentagon sought access to the bases in Colombia after Ecuadorian President Rafael Correa canceled the lease for the U.S. military base in Ecuador. However, the U.S. already engaged in 2 major theaters of war, Iraq and Afghanistan. They didn't make immediate use of them, just relocated what they already had there. Plan Colombia in practice is alive and well and has no interest in eradicating cocaine, in case you hadn't noticed. The private military contractors assist the Colombian narco elite in gaining a monopoly, not eliminating it, controlling it. The narco-colonialism is big business for corporate America and other places. The contemporary situation is reminiscent of how the CIA and the Argentina Anti-Communist Alliance, the AAA, which again goes back to Operation Gladio and Operation Condor, overthrew the governments and fought the rebel forces that tried to get rid of the CIA installed dictators. And the growing U.S. intervention in Colombia conflict is a 21st century version of Operation Condor. In a nutshell, the war on drugs and terror is part of a counter-revolutionary strategy designed to maintain rather than eliminate the economic conditions that allow drug trafficking to thrive. From Reagan to Obama, the U.S. covert intervention has paradoxically only accentuated the social violence and systemic production and distribution of cocaine. Colombia has been transformed into a narco state, increasing dependence on the privatization and corporatization of the U.S. drug and war on terror. And that concludes our book. Let me get Bridget back up here. So, what say you, SR 71?
Thank you, Colonel, and thank everyone for attending Spaces today. And on Rumble. And the book finally comes to a close. I'm looking at this from the standpoint, I recall very early on in my youth, when drugs were a problem back then, and we would see reports on TV of prison and drugs in prison and this, that, and the other. I asked my dad, I said, Dad, they're in prison. How in the hell are they getting these drugs? And he told me, he says, you know, you got a lot of people out there that are in charge of the prisons and the guards and this that let it happen. And that's what we're doing here. We're letting it happen. We know what's going on. We see it going on. We identify it, and yet we let it continue.
I would go farther than that. This is not a matter of letting it happen. We are actually making it happen. Letting it happen is a passive form of not doing anything about it. We are spending billions of dollars to make sure it does happen.
I agree with that. From letting it happen, I mean from the public's perspective.
Yeah. We are the economic arm facilitating the drug trafficking. We are giving them it is the United States drug crop by proxy. Colombia could not have done anything that they did in narco trafficking without the US's involvement. Their internal population would have taken care of their corrupt government if it had been left alone, just like what happened in Bolivia. And that's why the CIA and the US military has occupied Colombia to keep the FARC away from the Colombian government so that they could facilitate the narco trafficking. Because had the FARC been left alone, representing all of the people in the country, and what was clear in this book is the quote unquote peasants far outweighed the number of narco elite. That government would have been destroyed, like what we're watching in Nepal today, had it not been for the US military and the CIA and the State Department and all of the private military contractors and the selling of chemicals from US corporations. It was a 100% US proxy to create drugs to bring into America to poison us. Go ahead, SR 71.
With that, I agree 100%. The other thing I was looking at was AirScan. When you mentioned AirScan, they did wind up going to court concerning the bomb that killed 18 civilians, including children. That was a lawsuit. Glavis, Bajuka, the Occidental Petroleum et al. That was filed in 2003 under the Alien Tort Claims Act. The 3 involved employees disappeared, and investigations into their whereabouts, including possible ties to active duty U.S. military personnel, remain unresolved. Disappeared. I got a good feeling here that, well, they disappeared, they're gone, because you're not ever going to see them again. They'll never be able to talk.
Well, they were either killed and disposed of, or they're in a witness protection program somewhere being paid for the rest of their life. My gut tells me it's the first. Unfortunately.
I agree with that 100%. That's the only way you're going to guarantee the mouth stays shut.
Yeah. Bridget, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Well, I would say, rather than gut feeling, I would say my gladio glasses tell me that you're right.
Yeah.
Because we've seen it how many times? Patterns, over and over again.
Agree.
But, yeah, this is a pretty great book. It really tied a lot of different things together for me. A lot of it we already knew. Some new people probably didn't, but I think it really kind of ties everything together.
Well, I don't think we could have had a more timely book, given that it looks like we're actively engaged in an actual war on drugs.
Absolutely. And now you understand the why. And like the chemicals, I never would have understood how big a deal it was that they shut those chemicals down if we hadn't gone through how cocaine is made from the cocoa leaves.
Right.
So it all kind of ties back together.
Correct. Yeah, it is very interesting to learn. We've learned so much in all of these books. There's some new piece of information that divinely allows us to understand our current circumstances much better than the general population who has not went through these lessons. Go ahead, Renee.
Hey there. Happy, what are we, Tuesday, everyone? Good to be here. Yeah, I enjoyed the book, and especially how timely it was as well with what's going on with our military and all of South America. And following what Bridget was saying about the chemicals, I started to look more into those chemicals because you mentioned ethanol and acetone are big parts of the processing. And I know that Brazil is huge with the big agriculture, corn, soy, sugar, etc., which was brought in via the Rockefellers in the late 50s, the time of the coup, etc.
Specifically, Nelson Rockefeller.
Yep. He did go down there with his brother to set up the banking through Chase Manhattan.
Yep.
And so I started digging into the chemicals because I was curious if acetone, I know you mentioned in this book that it came from the States and elsewhere, but I was looking for any updates if Brazil now refines and produces acetone, and they actually do. And it is now included, and they really amped up the supply since about 2011 with adding on, with sugar, byproducts, biofuel, biodiesel, etc. They now make tons of acetone. And there are refineries. I kept getting leads to the state of Mato Grosso, which is butt up against Paraguay and Bolivia. And then I started searching into drug seizures over the past 5 years, and a good chunk of them have been in Mato Grosso. And there's two Mato Grossos. There's kind of like North Carolina, South Carolina. There's the northern Mato Grosso, and they have a lot of cattle and soy and mining. But a lot of the drug trafficking and seizures were in Mato Grosso do Sul, which is the one which is more butt up against a river in Paraguay. And interestingly enough, another connection was I discovered, of course I'm going to say, okay, was Rockefeller and his in cahoots there, and he actually was.
Yes, he was. So was the Bushes and the Moonies in Paraguay.
Yeah, but in Mato Grosso do Sul, South Mato Grosso, David and Nelson, another family member, Winthrop,
Yep.
who had a farm in Arkansas called Win Rock.
Yep.
They went into Mato Grosso do Sul and created a big farm, which is called Fazenda Bodoquena. And so they are all up in there and really were behind the whole initiation of it's called the Cerrado, these dry plains, where they brought in this big farming, big agro. They brought in scientists to figure out how to deal with the red clay soil and GMO seeds that work better. Even cows, they brought in cows from India because they survived better in the hot climate. They brought in grass seeds that grow. I mean, it's just crazy. And then a final note to this whole thing, because there's an abundance, this all ties in. But one of the guys who was there from day one in this Fazenda Bodoquena in Mato Grosso do Sul, he was a banker, a hard name to pronounce, but it's like Moraes Salas of Unibanco in Brazil.
Yeah.
And this was a bank who really in cahoots with Rockefellers and the funding, channeling of money and bringing in Western money into Brazil. And what's interesting is on top of that, so I started looking into this bank, Unibanco, which is now called Ituau, ITAU, Unibanco. And I'm like, what the heck does Ituau mean? And it's actually a Tupi Guarani indigenous word. The Tupis were in Uruguay, no? The Tupis, didn't we touch upon that name with the other book?
Well, the Tupamaros,
okay.
Yeah, those were the rebels that were in Uruguay.
Okay, it was similar. But so anyway, Tupa in Ituau in Tupi Guarani, guess what it means? Black rock.
Yep.
Isn't that crazy? Just keeps connecting, but I thought I'd share those.
No, thank you for sharing all that. Yeah, it's directly related.
Sure. Pleasure.
Illini, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Hey, Colonel. Yeah, it's been an interesting book, and if what is it, Oliver VR. If I had read this book 15 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to get through it, because every once in a while there's another, it's clearly written from a very left-wing perspective about capitalism and about capital. But I guess number one, it shows you that there's been a Hegelian dialectic going on that's made it harder for us to get all the facts. And then number two, we would have missed the whole foundation that they were standing on, 15, 20 years ago.
Correct.
With Seymour Hersh, with Iran-Contra, we would have missed, all the stuff about, I mean, I would not have known about Terry Reid. I would not have known about, Pete Bruton and Robert Perry and their books on the Bush families. And without Bush retaliating and the neoconservatives retaliating against Trump, we wouldn't have had the opportunity to kind of go back and review everything.
And that's a critical point. Thank you for making that point.
So because we have this political breakdown in Washington, D.C., we're able to overlook, some of the, political dividing lines that used to be there. And we're able to basically try to trace the facts and then try to put the different facts from different parties together and to basically corroborate stuff and basically draw the crimson thread all the way from, you got Seymour Hersh, Jack Anderson, talking about, Seymour Hersh talking about the drug trafficking in the 70s. You've got Carl Oglesby talking about it in the Cowboy-Yankee War. You've got a number of different journalists all covering it, in the 1980s, some of them losing their jobs for that coverage. And then, of course, it all connecting today. I wonder what Crimson Thread links will ultimately show up that might connect certain individuals, around the periphery of September 11th or Epstein back to Iran-Contra or, further back.
Yeah.
That'll be interesting.
The only thing that I would push back a little bit on is I don't know that there was ever a real political divide. The more I research, the more I'm convinced that there was never a political divide. They were just better at portraying the divide because of the control of the information. Now, absent their monopoly on controlling the information, and you're pointing out the authors that exposed most of this because of their they're being silenced, basically fired, assassinated, whatever. People avoided talking about it. And now there seems to be a much more bolder, free conversation occurring. And obviously being able, in hindsight, because of all of their work, from every perspective, regardless of what political orientation an author may have been. And that's why I don't avoid reading books that lean one way or the other, because if you don't look at both, you're going to miss. And, Doug Valentine's probably one of the biggest examples. He 100%, if you want to use the left-right paradigm, is on the left, but it doesn't discredit his work. And if we don't remove those blinders and look at all of the information in its totality, we are going to miss critical elements of it. Like Bridget said, I had no idea until I read this book how cocaine was actually made and the contribution of U.S. oligarchs to that process. Knowingly. So you really do have to broaden your library in reading everything. And you can put in perspective. I mean, at least this guy didn't, go out and, like Doug Valentine, God bless his heart, is a Trump hater. And he fails to see that, honest to goodness, there's actually an attempt to bring the temple down, because he is very, very jaded, and it makes reading his books harder because of his continued insertion of his opinion as opposed to just the facts. And so I respect the author of sticking with the facts. And I didn't come come away from reading the book as he was so much anti-capitalism, he was anti-colonialism and anti-use of the U.S. Apparatus that supposedly is there for freedom by basically going abroad and enslaving entire countries under their control, which I'm adamantly opposed to as well. So
the secret to assessing, a book's credibility is to check the notes and to
yes,
check the citations and to check the sources. And, as you mentioned, Doug Valentine, the cool thing about him is he posts the taped interviews online. You can
yes,
find those
yes,
on archive.org. He taped them back in like the late 80s. They've been sitting on archive.org for a long time. And you can actually hear the agents that he interviewed discussing what was going on. And that's pretty hard to refute, along with, the FOIA, requests that he's made to the CIA, including the one document, I think there's a Privacy Act request that he submitted that showed a CIA HR administrator, and I'll try to track this one down. I've emailed the colonel a screenshot of it, but that's out there too, where there's this internal CIA memo warning agents that Doug Valentine has collected an alarming number of facts about internal, CIA processes, and please don't talk to this person and give him any more information.
And that's a good point, because we have a lot of new listeners. So let me just reiterate that, because you make an excellent point, as you always do. I do not bring a single book to you guys that I have not extensively went through the notes and made sure that the author is not full of crap. There are books like that, and I own a few of them. Those will never be books that I bring to you. I go through, I find the old news articles on archive.org. I read them myself, especially if it's new information that I've never seen. If it's regurgitating something that we've come across in another book that I know for a fact is true, like a lot of these corporations that they were talking about. When I first started doing this, I researched every one of them. I could not believe that DynCorp had actually been involved in a lawsuit in the UK for trafficking people. That was just dumbfounding to me, but it in fact is true. And so now I know it's true. So when somebody writes about DynCorp doing something, I'm not at all surprised. But a lot of this guy's footnotes are from, like, for example, I'm looking at one right now from Noam Chomsky, that's Rogue States, and I have that book. And so when they use credible footnotes, he quotes several times McCoy's book, Politics of Heroin, which we've done. He does quote Valentine several times. So that's a great point. You really do. You can't just read stuff with footnotes and not actually read the footnotes. As a matter of fact, another point to Illini's point is most of the books in my library that I have, like when I read Paul Williams' book at the very beginning of this, I bought almost every book that he footnoted. They're in my library because I literally could not believe anything that Paul Williams said. It was just too far out there to me. The whole, accusations against the Vatican, the accusations that the Marshall Plan was really a corrupt initial funding for Operation Gladio. I was just incredulous at all of the information in that book. And now just about everything he footnoted as far as another book, I have. And I've checked their footnotes. So that's an excellent point. And I just want you guys to know that I don't bring you anything that I've not thoroughly researched.
One more point, and then I'll step off my soapbox and hand the mic to somebody else. You can imagine 15 years ago how Bill Kristol or Dick Cheney or a neoconservative political operative would have tried to discredit this book. He would have referenced, he would have, cited VR and Connell saying that, they thought that, or they try to downplay, kidnapping wealthy landowners, for ransom money by, the FARC, and that, said they were anti-capitalist, and that they said at the last chapter, which we read today, that capitalism needs to ever expand, and it needs to have these systems and processes that cause that expansion, including stuff like this. And he would have cited 3 or 4 different things that the author said to basically say these guys are communists and they're not incredible, without ever referring to the footnotes, the citations, or the actual facts that they cite.
Right.
And that is a technique
yes.
that they use. And so when you're in a Twitter space and you're going to go out, number one, the rule is to try to stay relatively politically balanced, but to focus on the facts and the stuff that you can prove, and to focus on the footnotes, and to focus on the definitive stuff. If you can do that, number one, it gets a lot harder, because the other thing that Crystal and the Republican operatives would try to do is discredit people by association.
Yep.
Simply by citing some of these people, you can get yourself into trouble if you don't know what you're doing. If you look at the actual citations and the actual evidence and the actual facts and the stuff that made, and ideally if you can start with the stuff that's already on the front page of the New York Times or the Washington Post, maybe it was 30 or 40 years ago, and maybe it was the stuff back then that earned these newspapers their reputations for journalism. If you can start there, and you can start with the hard authoritative facts, and then put together a mosaic of other relatively credible facts, you can bypass that whole thing, and you can force them to deal with you and your argument, which gets a lot harder.
Right. I agree with that 100%. And that's why, the accusation at the very beginning of this book, when they were talking about how Pablo Escobar was specifically sought out for assassination, the accusation, as Illini points out, was, well, you're basically trying to justify or kind of defend a drug trafficker. No, I'm telling you, he was 100% a drug trafficker. And it was reported both in the Washington Post and the Amnesty International. There was actually a lawsuit filed to get CIA records, because if you don't investigate the connections of who Pablo Escobar's enemies were inside of Colombia, they were all of the people that had known ties to the CIA. And there's extensive footnotes in this guy's book using people like the New York Times, the Washington Post, Peter Dale Scott, very well, not that the Washington Post is reputable, but to Illini's point, they even covered Castano, the guy that was basically behind Pablo Escobar's, his ties to the narco elite and to the CIA, and Pablo Escobar was his competition. Along with the facts that Pablo Escobar was well known inside of Colombia to be adamantly against any of the drug traffickers that was using U.S. banks to launder their money, leaving their money outside of Colombia. Would never, ever suggest Pablo Escobar was not a drug trafficker, was not doing bad things. But I want people to understand this is not about fighting drugs. This has always been about taking out the competition of the drugs they don't control. That has been, as Bridget points out, a pattern. It was true with the Corsican Mafia in France. It was true with the drug trafficking that went on in the Golden Triangle. If you were there as a competitor to the network the CIA was setting up and controlling, you would be taken out. And obviously, there's a problem when you have story after story after story of all the drug traffickers are bad. Okay, let's just see that point. When the CIA is behind assassinations, and the US government, in the form of Nixon's war on drugs and the taking out of the Corsican mafia, in order to channel all of the drug control into a particular pipeline, to me, it's all evil. There's more evil when you are actually murdering people in order to control the drugs that's poisoning your population than the ones who aren't. They're all evil. And the same thing with the FARC. You would never hear me say that they were not involved in cocaine. To the extent that they were involved in the manufacturing, I have no clue, because you're never going to get an honest assessment of the FARC's lab creation of cocaine as opposed to their doing a traditional coca cultivation as Bolivia did under Evo Morales. And the framing that we documented throughout this book of the FARC in bombings that they had nothing to do with, in labs that were set up to make it look like it was a FARC by leaving a FARC uniform there. It indicates to me, which I have no credible evidence one way or the other, that they were much less involved in the actual manufacturing of cocaine, 100% involved in the coca cultivation. But as we've learned, the coca cultivation is completely different than manufacturing of cocaine. And that really should be the big takeaways from this book. We learned how cocaine was made. We learned that we were lied to about the FARC. We learned that we were lied to about Pablo Escobar. And that is not justifying any of it. It's just asking a whole bunch of new questions about why our government lies to us about all of it, because they clearly lie to us about everything. Renee, go ahead.
Yeah, that said, and how we've been lied, it seems like everything is inverted. You know, the bad is good and the good is bad. That said, and what at this point, what we've learned about this region of South America, Panama, Central America, etc., does it seem possible that that's what Trump is exactly doing in the theater of war? He's kind of placing Venezuela as the decoy, because it seems what we've learned is everyone else around Venezuela is in cahoots with this all these lies, you know, and the manufacturing, the trafficking, the banking, the everything, and it's very confusing to try and the majority of people who don't know all these backstories and details, a majority are up in arms and thinking Trump is just going in there after the oil. But there's so many layers and to this whole operation right now. It's a big theater, and there's just so many details. I think we as a group here know a little more through you and what we've learned. But it's so complicated, this operation right now, what's going on. But, the pirates over all this time of going in the Caribbean and what they've done with the Americas to the south of us, learning these patterns and learning their shady dealings, it seems like, Venezuela could be a decoy. It's a covert, another flip via Trump of a covert operation. What do you think?
So I wouldn't use the word decoy. That's militarily, I don't believe that that's an accurate word. And that obviously is the problem in talking about current events with what we know. Because, as I said on the Alpha Warrior show, I don't know whose intelligence they're using. If they're using CIA intelligence, which hopefully they're not, um, you know, obviously making Venezuela the boogeyman. And I'm not saying Venezuela's good. It's not good. None of this is good. Okay. Just don't misunderstand me. None of it's good. Um, I know a little bit more about how that waterway on the western side of Venezuela is used. I know that the indigenous people that occupy that waterway for legitimate sustainment as far as fishing goes, that the Colombian sources of the cocaine and other drugs that are manufactured in Colombian controlled labs use those indigenous fishing vehicles. They retrofit them with motors, and then they will actually kidnap people and hold them for ransom with the threat of harming their families as couriers. Um, I also know that that was not one of their fishing actual boats because they don't have multiple motors. Most of the indigenous people row themselves around because they're that poor. They will save up for years to buy a single motor for their boat. So, where that boat came from, my only caveat is whose intelligence are they using? I have no doubt there was drugs on that boat. I have no doubt that the people that were pointed, because I have no doubt, as we just articulated in this last chapter, there's so much surveillance done of that entire region. There would be no way that we don't know everywhere that everything is happening. We have so much surveillance over it. There's no way that from the 1970s until today that all of this shit has gone on and no one knew. We knew about all of it. So, whatever the reason that they took that particular boat out, sent a clear message. That boat was going most likely to a larger ship, because what they do is they ferry drugs onto the ship that's anchored at sea, and they will refuel the boat when they get when they get to the ship for the return trek. There's also islands along that border that they compile larger shipments, bring the larger ship in, or a submarine, in order to further transport that. So that to me was more a shot across the bow to know that we're watching you down to that level of detail. There was a clear signal sent to the entire network. At some point, the entire network, which emanates around Colombia, there's going to be total chaos when you start hitting the actual source of the drugs and the logistics uh, train that is the ferrying of the drugs out to the larger container ships or ships in general, that then, or submarines, like I said, from the islands that then carry that. So I see this as a disruption of their network and a clear signal that we know. That's the way I would describe it. Texas Annie, go ahead.
Hi, Colonel. Thanks for letting me come up. Yeah, this is a very, very interesting book, and thank you so much for bringing this one to us. I sure learned a lot, learning a lot through everything you guys have been doing, and I loved you and Bridget together.
Thank you.
When you guys were doing your thing together. I hope you like the pictures. But oh God, finding out how they make cocaine, It's kind of like if you ever knew how they made sausage, you wouldn't eat it again either. That type of thing. But yeah, I saw this little blurb on Telegram up here that Scavino put out. I thought you'd get a kick out of it. I put it up top. It says, it's not Iran, it's the CIA. It's not China, it's the CIA, and so on. It goes down. It's not Congress, it's not the UN, everything. It's the CIA. I thought you'd get a kick out of that.
Thank you.
All right, thanks for letting me come up.
Sure. What happened to the crazy guy? I didn't see his whole name. He was up here waiting.
I don't know, he just disappeared.
Okay.
I got kicked out 3 or 4 times, so.
Why are you so mad? You can go ahead and go, and then we'll go to Stellar.
I have a question about the boat that was supposedly blown up with all the drugs on it, or the seizure of drugs. Is it a possibility? Because I listened to this Finance Daily in the morning, and they mentioned something about Venezuela trying to get involved in Ghana's election, and I don't know how that would be involved in Ghana's election.
Are you talking about Guyana?
Guyana, yeah. Their election coming up, and how Venezuela, I don't know who in Venezuela or what side in Venezuela would be involved in trying to to mess up that election. Is that a possibility?
Well, anything's a possibility. A long time ago, talked extensively about Guyana. The CIA has overthrown their government at least twice in Guyana. More recently, what came to light is there was a discovery of a massive oil reserve off the coast of Guyana in a contested area of the coastline that Venezuela believes is their international recognized border, as opposed to Guyana's, where the oil was discovered. And this has went on for decades, if not 100 years, as far as the contested location where the oil. So it goes back a long time. So does Venezuela have an interest in the election? Yes, they do. I would be very skeptical of anyone's assertion that they're involved in election meddling. I would take that with a grain of salt, because the people that would have been generally involved in election interference is the U.S. corporations that want a concession from Guyana on that oil, because Venezuela has made it well known, after having kicked out Exxon and all of the U.S. oil monopolies in their country. So does that give Venezuela a motivating factor that they don't want them in those contested waters? Absolutely. So do they have motivation to do that? Yes.
Okay, but when it comes to election meddling, that's more like the CIA's kind of.
It has, since 1948. There is nobody on earth that's done more election interference, both domestically and abroad, than the CIA / NATO / the UK.
100%. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. That's what I was kind of figuring.
So
thank you for clearing up. And I also want to state that you are such a wealth of information and a lot of issues, and what you put out about the Hyundai Corporation,
yes,
and the Japanese Samsung and all that stuff. Absolutely amazing.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you. Seller, go ahead.
I'm noticing that, or tell me if I'm wrong, but the Venezuelan stuff has been going on for a long time, even though we had good relations with them, supposedly, for a while, and until Chavez. But do you see similarities with Iran? Like what happened, like with the colonials seem to be the ones that cause all these issues too, along with the CIA, and even like Iraq, because it seems like they input people, and and stuff. Or am I completely off on this one?
So I don't know what analogy you're trying to get to. I have recognized that I am one of the people that do not agree that there was a complete change of authority in Iran. I believe that the Shah was a very evil person. His thwarting of the rest of Iran for the elite in Tehran and all of those people that post those stupid pictures of, oh, the 70s, everybody was lovely in Iran. They weren't. The people in Tehran and a few of the major cities, which were referred to as the elite in Iran, um, did have modern conveniences, but that was at the expense of the rest of Iran, who did not want the Shah because the Shah was corrupt. He had the Sabak, that was basically the terror organization, as we saw the DINA in Chile and everything else. He was installed by the CIA after overthrowing Mossadegh. So the overthrow of the Shah by the Ayatollah, who, by the way, just mysteriously was living in France and being taken care of by the state, his insertion into the whole thing in order to hold hostage the Carter administration and basically ensure that Jimmy Carter was not reelected. And he just so happens to be, and again, I don't like Jimmy Carter, so don't get that impression. But he happens to be the only president since 1947 that fired the entire covert arm that went out and overthrew the governments and interfered in elections. He's the only one. And so his entire administration for the last year he was in office was hamstrung by this Iran hostage situation, which, if you dig into that, you find out that the majority of the hostages that were taken hostage all happened to be CIA, who was working in the embassy that was guarded by the Marines and a bunch of CIA people. And we're supposed to believe that a bunch of students just walked into the embassy and took all them hostage. It's beyond believable, any aspect of it, when you actually go back and start looking at it. Of course, you're overwhelmed by information and sensationalization of it, so people don't sit down and think for 5 seconds, how the hell did a bunch of dumbass students overthrow one of our embassies with armed guards? And so, again, with our Gladio glasses, when you go back and you look at it, it's completely something. And we know about the October surprise, where they gave a shipment from Israel, funded by US taxpayers, to the Ayatollah for holding them past the election to ensure Reagan won the election. And then we gave them a second shipment during Iran Contra of missiles. And so in the 80s, during the Reagan administration, when supposedly we were arming Iraq in the Iran-Iraq war, we were secretly shipping missiles to Iran for them to attack Iraq. So the meme about somehow we're funding this side of the war while at the same time our taxpayer dollars are funding the other side, that's the classic meme for the Iran-Iraq war. We were literally funding both sides. And so the support of the Iranian government over the years, when supposedly it was under the control of the Ayatollah, is on its face not believable anymore. In addition to that, the entire Savak apparatus that was set up by Major General Norman Schwarzkopf Sr. and was a terror organization to be unleashed on the Iranian people, 100%, with the exception of one small office and a change of names, stayed in TAC. So the terror police that the Ayatollah had at his command was all trained and equipped by the United States government, and he did not dissolve it. The same people were there. So I don't think there's a comparison in Venezuela to Iran for those reasons. The Chavez and past in Venezuela does seem to be an honest effort to get U.S. oligarchs out of Venezuela. And if you go back to Chavez, it's interesting to note that despite the U.S. government constantly being in Venezuela with USAID, they actually owned one of the major newspapers the CIA through a front company did. So if Chavez is supposed to be the dictator that we were told he was, why did they have an independent newspaper there that was basically owned by the CIA? So I have lots of questions when it comes to Venezuela. And one of the most notable disconnects for me in my brain is that everybody likes to point out that the election system, Smartmatic, all of that stuff, all goes back to software that supposedly in the election machines that came out of Venezuela. And so over the past period of time that the US has used this, our elections has been perfect. If you listen to anybody, not patriots, but the mainstream media, our elections are perfect using that same system. But somehow every single time the elections happen in Venezuela, they're all corrupt. Well, if we use the same software as everybody's and machines as everyone says they are, how are theirs always corrupt and ours are perfect? Again, I'm just observing what the stories are that we're being told, and none of the stories we're being told make any sense. Who's lying? I don't know. But I do think Venezuela is an anomaly that I've not come across. I think the closest you could get would be to compare them with Cuba, in that they 100% don't want any involvement of the US. And as a result of that, they become a major thorn in the side because you're not allowed to do that. Go ahead, Stellar.
Okay, so that makes more sense why the West or OPEC company or countries were dropping the prices in the 80s. It was because I mean there was a whole bunch of their inflation went crazy when they devalued their money because of the oil, right? So that's why they were trying to do it, was to have them in hardship so that
yes.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. SR 71.
Thank you, Colonel. I saw Why Are You So Mad had a hand up, and if he's ready for a mic, I'll let Why Are You So Mad go. Otherwise, I do have a comment.
Well, I think he went. The guy that didn't go isn't here anymore.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Colonel. Anyway, I'm looking at some of the other stuff that's going on in the news right now, specifically at Nepal, and what went on in Nepal and how things are going there. And I've come to the conclusion at this point that what we're seeing is they have figured out they are not going to draw the U.S. into an armed conflict. So now the deal is to create as much havoc across the entire region as they can. The U.S. is not going to enter into an armed conflict there at all. I don't believe that's going to be the case.
Who's they? Who do you think's trying to draw? Who's they? Who are you calling they?
The international syndicate and the CIA and everybody else that's involved in what's going on with this kind of stuff. Now, who's going to ultimately sit in the throne there in Nepal, I have no idea, and nobody seems to have that idea yet either. But I'm sure whatever's coming is one of their own choosing.
Well, I hope that's the case, because the U.S. government, USAID, and I hope this is not true. I I hope it doesn't take what's going on in Nepal to transition, but it may be. For those of you who aren't aware, when we looked at that region of the world, it was very clear that the US government, through coups, has controlled Nepal for a very long time. And they are strategically located between China and India. And it was critical to the CIA's operation to have Nepal under their thumb. And through USAID, the National Endowment for Democracy, and all of their arms of political power, foundations, whatever, they've been intimately involved in Nepal. Nepal was used as a launching pad, both when we were training terrorists to input into Tibet and stay behind units, and when we were involved with the Uyghurs to train them as terrorists to insert into the province that borders Nepal. So the CIA has been very active in Nepal. And I think with the closing of USAID, the civilian population of Nepal realized that they didn't have to put up with their shit anymore. And so the first time their government tried censoring them and taking down social media so they could all communicate with each other, they said no more. You're not going to control us the way you have in the past. And you're seeing the fallout of that. Now, hopefully, there's a more peaceful transition of these countries that are going to transition out of being puppet states of the West around the world, but maybe not. Maybe this is the way citizens in other geographical locations take back their government. But I can tell you, had we continued to go down the path that we were on, we would be Nepal. At some point in the United States, that would be happening here, because there is only so much with the communication capability that people have that would not be happening here. Thank God it didn't, and thank God we were able to get Trump back in office so that there is a controlled transition from the monopoly of the international syndicate and the control over the mechanisms of power in the United States, so that we don't have to experience that here. I don't know that that's going to be the case in other countries. It's going to be a very rocky road from here on out, because as SR 71 said, there isn't going to be a USAID-led effort to control governments in the future. That's gone. Go ahead. Go ahead, SR.
Thank you, Colonel. I appreciate that. The other thing that I'm thinking about while this is going on, you also have Qatar that was just recently hit. Now, in Nepal, the cases, the civilian population is actually hunting down all of those that were in the administration to beat the stew out of them in the street. So they got no place to run. They burned down the Parliament building, so that's gone. Where they go from there is the next question. And I found it very interesting that you could put COVID out and lock people up and keep them in their homes, but the minute you take away their social media, you got a riot like nobody's business.
No. But they did COVID while the CIA was still there and USAID was still there. They're never going to allow that to happen with those forces on the ground. You had to have USAID and the money behind the people, their foot soldiers on the ground to control the population. So I wouldn't equate COVID to the current situation, because the infrastructure for control is gone. That's the point I'm making.
Thank you, Colonel. And the point is very clear, because you don't see any police, any military, or whatever trying to stop it.
They also set the media their media company. They're like the equivalent of the New York Times on fire as well. So yeah, they're definitely taking their government back. And again, I don't know where they go from here. There's going to be some temporary chaos involved in that, and that just happens to be the aftermath of the havoc. As Margaret Rogers' book says, that's the blowback that you get from oppressing people for decades on end.
Dismantling a 100-plus-year-old cabal, a international criminal syndicate, is not going to be not going to be a smooth ride. And I believe, as you know,
Yeah, I agree. Alini, did you want to say something?
Colonel, I'm curious about what your next book is going to be, or whether you're going to take a couple days off to deal with all the stuff related to Epstein and September 11th and the Federal Reserve that's kind of dropping right now.
That's a good question. I really want to do Dark Alliance. I think it's important for a lot of reasons of and I don't know how to say this, almost honoring the work that Gary Webb put into all of the research that he did. I feel like we're the proper venue to do that. So that's been weighing a lot on me. I do think that we should take the next couple of days to do exactly as you say. As a matter of fact, I was going to let everyone know, and this is the perfect transition. I was invited to a Zoom call of a bunch of people that are going to be addressing 9/11 in a very unique way. I don't want to say too much about it. I don't know a lot about it, number one. But that phone call is tonight. And so I'm going to, I'm tentatively scheduled to do Gary Webb's book. So that's definitely kind of on deck. And I will spend the next couple of days, depending on how the Zoom call goes and the notes that I take. We may be talking about that tomorrow. I think that's fitting. And talking about some of the stuff that's going on. Obviously, we just covered Nepal. That would definitely be on the list. And maybe we'll take a little bit of time tomorrow, depending on how this phone call goes, to go into the history of Nepal so people can understand the pent up turmoil that is going on there. And then probably we're already going to be at Wednesday tomorrow, maybe take the rest of the week to do that and then start our new book on Monday. If that sounds good to everybody. Okay.
It's your call, Colonel, as long as we've got the schedule.
Yeah. So I think we'll start our new book on Monday and we'll take the rest of the week kind of to review. I do think that it would be a good opportunity to go through the history, what we know of it, and we did do that a little bit. Well, we did a lot on Guyana and Venezuela. So that since that's in the news as well, I'll share with you a little bit more about the complexities of Venezuela when it comes to the drug trafficking allegations and that type of thing as well. Because I think all of that's very important. Dante, go ahead. I haven't seen you in forever. Where have you been?
I have been here and I've been there. I've been a little bit kind of everywhere. Just keep my head down. I'm working on some stuff on the back end, but yeah, Pretty interesting stuff that happened today with Nepal and over in Qatar as well. Actually, it's pretty interesting. I actually saw that building when I was in Doha back in 2010. Now it's like level because it's like a very unmistakable like architecture that they had. Like the building itself just sticks out like a sore thumb, but to go with all those fake empty skyscrapers that they built. But, yeah, Nepal's definitely an interesting case, and it's kind of a. I mean, we're gonna have to wait and see like what comes out with it. But the fact that they went from basically like Oli was a known drug lord. He was a huge puppet for the CCP. He had actually was notorious for selling property to he sold Nepalese property to the CCP. And he was also frequently down in Bangladesh with Yunus. So that kind of tells you where he fell on the axis. Within the axis, let's call them the Axis forces. But 48 hours, that is, they're going to be studying how that happened for a very long time, because either that was like the most genuine and organic coup that ever happened, and they just knew everything in and out, the whole infrastructure, and the military was in on it from the get-go and saying no. By the way, the military has taken control again. They're going to put up a de facto government. And if I'm hedging bets, they're going to reinstall the monarchy. So we'll see. But 48 hours is just nuts. But that's a huge middle finger to China and Pakistan. That really hinders China's drug corridor going down to Iraq and not Iraq, going down to Afghanistan and then eventually down into Pakistan, where they ship it out from Karachi. So Bangladesh was going to be next because the Jamaatists were going to move in there with this next election in April, and then they're tied in at the hip. Those jihadists, they are crazy, by the way. They're basically pals up with the CCP. They're being pushed in there. And Pakistan, and specifically the ISI, which is basically controlled by the Jamaats.
So are you suggesting that the jihadists that was originally homegrown through ISI and Afghanistan by the CIA has been overtaken by the CCP?
Yeah, absolutely. So Operation Cyclone, I mean, it's not even really kind of a secret anymore. Especially because like Maududi's family lived in New York. Maududi's the guy who created Jamaat-e-Islami back in the 40s, which, for those of you who don't know, that's the political party, which basically came to life. We talked about this last time, the Pakistan Civil War, East Pakistan, Bangladesh.
Right.
And they're the ones who basically, Maududi is basically the godfather of jihadist political thought right there with Sayyid Qutb. So I'm pretty sure I butcher his name like I always do, but it's Qutb. Anyways, that guy. But they were like basically the guys who created like radical Islamist, like jihadist political thought. And just for reference, Khomeini, before he was the Ayatollah, he used to go to listen to Maududi speak, and Maududi would confer with him, and they were very close. And then Maududi would jump on a jet, and then go do Hajj, and then he would meet with the Saudi, with the House of Saud, the royal family. So that's kind of just to give you an idea of how that dude was. So you don't really hear a lot of people talking about him or Jamaat, but Jamaat is actually, just to give you an idea of who they are, they have two basic militant wings with them. So their finance wing is a charity called the Al Khidmat Foundation, but they have like two very main prominent militant wings. One's called Lashkar-e-Taiba, which is one of the first entities designated after 9/11. And the other one's called Hizbul Mujahideen. And according to some reports, i.e. the local police in Afghanistan, the house where Osama bin Laden was raided was in fact controlled and registered to Hizbul Mujahideen, which is, again, Jamaat-e-Islami. And these are the guys who are back in the, they backed Yunus during the coup in 2024, which has been very pro-CCP. And they're basically, they were banned in elections before that. They were banned by the previous parties. In the Emir, it's actually pretty interesting because you guys want some context here. One of the emirs, it was a guy who went by the name of Modiur Rahman Nizami. He was hanged in 2016 for genocide and war crimes committed during the Pakistan Civil War during 1971. And he was the leader of the JI. Well, his son is now living in D.C. Well, he lives between New York, D.C., and Boston. And he is the treasurer for the USCMO, which is the U.S. Council for Muslim Organizations. It's basically the umbrella organization for all Islamic entities. And they basically do all the lobbying for Islam on the Hill. And his son is the treasurer as of 2024. So
isn't that weird that they live in the U.S.?
So a lot of them came over, again, going back to Operation Cyclone. Duty's granddaughter actually just ran for Cobb County Republican chairwoman, and she lost. But, just think about that for a second.
Well, but that's my point, that all of these people that are involved in these operations overseas, just like we saw with all of the Banderites after World War II, they all found homes in the United States.
Yeah, they did. As a matter of fact, Galen even had a house. He bragged about his house next to Dulles and McLean.
Yeah.
But going back to Maldudi's family, they were brought over here back in the 60s. So this was before a lot of, what some would call the fourth wave of terrorism. They were basically brought over here because they were actually still doing open, and this is open. It's not a well-kept secret. They created the Mujahideen. The CIA was running the Mujahideen.
Yes, they were.
And so a lot of them got blanket umbrella permissions to come over here to the U.S. and start a life. And Maldudi's son became the first elected secretary of an organization called HAXA. It eventually became known as ICNA, the Islamic Circle of North America. And it is the organization which gave birth to not only the USCMO, but also CARE, Feet Council, and they work closely in concert with the Islamic Society of North America, which is kind of more from the Egyptian school side. But yeah, he was the first elected secretary of that, and his daddy was Malduti, and he was a doctor. He was a medical doctor. He lost his license in 2006. He was forced to surrender it for 20, either 21 or 23 counts of medical malpractice. I can't remember the exact number, but you get the gist.
Yeah. But that's been a pattern. As a matter of fact, I talked about it last week on Apple Warrior Show, that everywhere that we have went and did these operations, there's this migration of people that participated with the CIA to the United States. And the majority of them are terrorists.
Yes, they are. And make no mistake, they're extremely loyal to the Pakistani ISI, which is no longer taking its orders from DC, let's say, there is a heavy CCP influence within the ISI,
and that is because of that economic corridor that Pakistan.
Correct.
Yes, and you're mentioning of Afghanistan. The current Afghan administration is in talks with joining that economic corridor.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, and that gives them. That's why what happened in Nepal throws such a huge kink in their plans, because just look at the map. I mean, whoever was like, okay, we got to stop this somehow. Like, either it was like the most brilliant geopolitical Hail Mary ever, or it was genuine. It was organic. But again, 48 hours tells me it was probably a combination of both. But, cui bono, who benefits, I mean, there's what's interesting is what you're seeing in India right now, because like a lot of like Indian influencers are like saying, there are a lot of people on social media who are paid for by like the globalist camp in India who are all like, oh, it was the West or the U.S. They're trying to point fingers elsewhere, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was India, because again, RAW, their research and analysis wing is one of the best intelligence organizations in the world. But it's interesting because the ISI has a lot of influence. They're even trying really hard to infiltrate Trump's camp. Like I said, Farouk, her name's Farouk. Maldudi's granddaughter, she had a lot of people from like Trump's, like let's say, like the grassroots movement down there. Like she had a lot of people hoodwinked down there, and she basically didn't even exist on paper before 2 years ago. So, and there's a whole myriad of anomalies I could go into with that in itself, but Trump is I think he probably realizes now he has some snakes in his camp, but the ISI is actively trying to, and there's an organization called ANWEC. And ANWEC is it's a delegation of Muslims who are connected to the ISI, but they pose as like, just altruist, U.S. based, a lot of them are like journalists or like interfaith religious leaders. But if you look at a lot of like their religious affiliations, like especially on the Catholic side, they're all like progressive LGBT churches.
Right.
Like there's one dude on there who's a Sikh, but he's not an actual Sikh. He's from a fake sect called Sikh Dharma, which is basically like a freaking sex cult. I mean, their founder Yogi Bhajan, who immigrated to the U.S. Well, he immigrated to Canada and then to the U.S. in the 60s. He was like the guy who created like the Tantra and like all this other crap. And he was charged with like multiple counts of sexual assault. They actually did an investigation in 2020 into the organization did, and they found hundreds of accounts of sexual assault were committed by this guy, Yogi Bhajan. And what's interesting enough about that is the organization which he ran called Sikh Dharma International. It's in New Mexico. It's called 3HO. They are closely affiliated. You're going to find this as a trip, Colonel. They are basically tied at the hip with a company called Call Security, Call Global, right?
What is it? What is it?
Call Security. That's AKAL.
Okay.
It's a reference to the Akali, and these guys are, again, they're whack jobs. They're fake Sikhs. Like these guys are, they're what they call Khalistanis, right? That's why they all changed their last name to Khalsa. Like Billy Joe Bob, whenever he gets recruited in to seek Dharma from Connecticut. He changes his name to like, Singh Khalsa or something like that, And anyways, the call security was actually up until last year when they basically had to disband because of the sexual abuse allegations. They were the largest force supplier for federal contractors. They were the largest supplier of force protection for Department of Defense, DHS, DOJ, Marshal Service, NASA. Get where I'm going with that? How wild is that?
That's wild.
And these guys are like all about and for those of you who don't know, the Palestine Liberation Force is a designated terrorist group. They're a radical sect, which basically nobody in India actually gives a crap about the Palestine stuff anymore. It's basically just like a talking point for this Sikh Dharma, which is this U.S. based sect, which is also sitting on the AMLEC Commission, which is basically dictating. They're getting ISI talking points, and they're basically dictating. They largely control a lot of the media narratives around Middle East foreign policy, and to the point where they were actually tasked with the Sharaka delegation. They were actually tasked to go to Israel to negotiate not only hostage release, but also ceasefire and armistice measures. And the woman who runs it her name's Anila Ali, and she's lifelong Democrat, super hardcore Democrat, just like everyone else in AMLEC. There's even DNC super delegates are listed there, but for some reason now they're all of a sudden a conservative MAGA organization, and they're basically in bed with Newsmax. As a matter of fact, they just did a documentary on Newsmax called "Making a Home for Muslims in America" or something like that, and it's pretty interesting because some of the senior editorial staff over there are in love with the Jamaat assholes, and they know they're Jamaat too. That's the crazy part.
So we're gonna kind of leave it there for today. I've got to run, but we'll. I don't know if you're available tomorrow, but we can continue this conversation. Go ahead, SR71.
Thank you, Colonel. Just one note back to USA. I did read today that UN is now asking for donations to help out the Afghans after the earthquake. So obviously USA has been really troubled. Thank you, Colonel.
Sure. That's a good way to leave that conversation today.
Hey, Colonel, I got one more for you, just to kind of segue into tomorrow's conversation.
Okay.
Did you know that the branch of Standard Chartered Bank located in Building 7 was actually known at the time in 2001, and this didn't come out until the 2007 lawsuit, mainly attributed to the Holy Land Foundation. But in 2001, that specific branch located in Building 7, Tower 7, was the sole facility sole branch Standard Chartered Bank was using to skirt and launder Iranian funds.
I did not know that.
Yeah. It's a bit of a weird one. Anyways.
All right.
I'll try and make it tomorrow. I make no promises, but I'll see what I can do.
Sure. Okay. Thanks everybody for being here. We will continue this conversation tomorrow. And everyone have a nice evening. And I will report back tomorrow what I find out from the Zoom call tonight. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
See you guys later.